Hello there, algebra friends. Hola, ¿cómo está? Soy bien. If you took French, sorry, I took Spanish. Okay, so we're on Unit 9, Lesson 9, the second day of the quadratic formula. So yesterday in class, we did some quadratic formula work. So today you're doing some more practice with that on your own. Let's just review exactly what is this quadratic formula. Well, the quadratic formula, kind of like the song Row, Row, Row Your Boat, x equals minus b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So if you like to sing, you can sing Row, Row, Row Your Boat with some mathematical lyrics. X equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. It works. That's how I learned it. Actually, I learned it just by studying and memorizing it, but whatever. Now, the discriminant is just the part underneath the square root sign, the b squared minus 4ac. That part of our calculation will determine whether our roots are rational, irrational, or imaginary. Because that part of the calculation is under a radical, that has all the power as to what types of roots we're going to have. So when we're doing the quadratic formula, remember that our numbers come from our equation in standard form, where a is the coefficient of the x squared term, b is the number next to x, and c is the number at the end. If one of those values is not missing, then we put a 0 in its place. So if I have something like 3x squared plus 8, then a is equal to 3, b is equal to 0 because there's no x term, and c is equal to 8. Okay, that's what I mean by putting a 0 in. If I had something like x squared plus x plus 8, a is equal to 1 because the invisible coefficient of x squared, if we don't see a number there, is 1, but the x squared is still there. Same thing with our b value. Our b value would also be 1, and c is 8 again. All right, so the discriminant is the way to tell whether our roots are going to be rational numbers, irrational numbers, or imaginary numbers. So our roots will be rational numbers when our discriminant is a perfect square. Now, earlier in this unit, we did a list of numbers that were perfect squares. 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, 5 squared is 25, 6 squared is 36. One of those numbers, if the square root portion, the discriminant, the b squared minus 4ac, if that turns out to be a perfect square, then when we go to solve it, the square root of that perfect square comes out of the radical. When the radical goes away, our number becomes rational. It becomes a decimal that either repeats or ends. That's rational. Now, if our b squared minus 4ac is not a perfect square, then it's going to be irrational. If the radical is still there, then we have an irrational answer. And then lastly, if our b squared minus 4ac is negative, then our roots are imaginary. Okay, so if you're asked for what type of roots they are, you don't you don't have to solve everything. You can just find the value of the discriminant, and based on that number, you can tell whether it's rational, irrational, or imaginary. Okay, now let's practice the whole big thing. Let's do some full out fun with the quadratic formula. So remember, we have to get it equal to 0 first. If it is already equal to 0, that's fantastic. That's one less thing we have to worry about. But if it's not equal to 0, we have to take care of that. So for our first example, it is already equal to 0. What's our a value? A is the coefficient of the x squared, the number in front of x squared. If you don't see a number there, but you do see the x squared, that means a is 1. So what's the b value? B value is 2. What's our c value? Now our c value is negative 8. The subtraction sign is telling us it is a negative number, so it's negative 8. So our formula is x equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now you go to your calculator. When you do this on the calculator, you're going to plug in what's underneath the radical, the discriminant. Plug that in first on its own. So it'll be 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 8. So I type in 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 8. If you want to use parentheses like I wrote it on my paper, 4 times 1 times negative 8 like that, that works as well. So that means our discriminant is 36. So when I go back over to my paper and rewrite my problem, back over to my paper, rewrite my problem, I get x equals, and then negating the 2 makes it negative 2 plus or minus, and we figured out that all the discriminant calculation turns into 36. 2 times 1 in the denominator is 2. Now 36 is a perfect square, excuse me, perfect square. So the square root of 36 is 6. So my two roots come where x is equal to negative 2 plus 6 divided by 2, and x equals negative 2 minus 6 divided by 2. That's my two different answers. So that would be, let's see, negative 2 plus 6 is 4. 4 divided by 2 is 2. Negative 2 minus 6 more is negative 8. Divided by 2 is negative 4. So those are my two roots, which are also sometimes called the zeros. So those are real rational numbers. Two rational roots. Okay, let's try another one. So remember, we have to get our equation equal to 0 first. So the first thing we need to do here is subtract 12 from both sides and rewrite the equation. So it becomes x squared minus 4x minus 12 equals 0. Now I can pick out my a value of 1. My b value, because it's subtracting the 4x, that means it's a negative 4. And for my c value, because it's subtract 12 at the end, that means that it is a negative 12. So plug your numbers into your formula. X equals negative b, and the b value is negative 4, so make sure you put in the negative 4 inside the parentheses. Plus or minus square root b squared, which is negative 4, minus 4 times a times c, which is negative 12, divided by 2a. So again, we're going to go to the calculator. We have negative 4 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 12. So negative 4 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 12. Okay, so that gives me a 64. You should be making sure you're typing this in on your own calculator to make sure you're typing it in correctly. It is important to practice the typing into the calculator and make sure you're doing it right. All right, so here, the formula says negate the b value. So I'm negating negative 4. The double negative turns into positive 4. The discriminant calculation was 64. We did that on the calculator. Divided by 2a. 2 times 1 is just 2. Now the square root of 64 is again a perfect square. Square root of 64 is 8. So now my two roots become x equals 4 plus 8 over 2. And then x equals 4 minus 8 over 2. 4 plus 8 is 12. And 12 divided by 2 is 6. That's my first 0. And then 4 minus 8 is negative 4. Negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. That's my other 0. again, because our discriminant was a perfect square, we have two rational roots. Now, if our roots ended up rational, that means that they probably would have factored at the beginning. If we end up with rational roots, that means we can factor it. If they're not rational or they end up imaginary, then this equation could not be solved by factoring. All right, so let's turn the page, keep going. 5x squared equals negative 5x plus 1. First rule we need to do is get it equal to 0. Obviously, I meant 0. Get it equal to 0. So we're going to add the 5x over and subtract the 1. So it becomes 5x squared plus 5x minus 1 equals 0. That means my a value is 5, my b value is 5, and c is negative 1. So I want you to plug these into the formula, and then, yeah, plug them into the formula. Let's see if you can put all the numbers in the right places. If you have to, sing the song. Now let's do the calculation. Negative 5 plus or minus, so you're doing 5 squared minus 4 times 5 times negative 1. So that gives us a 45 that's supposed to go into our radical. Now for this one, our radical, the discriminant, is not a perfect square. So we're going to have irrational roots. Okay, so if we have irrational roots, we're going to leave it in simplified radical form, and then we can also round it to the nearest tenth according to the directions right below us here in the box. To simplify our radical, I'm going to take the square root of 45 and figure out the largest perfect square that is a factor of 45. So I can either do that on the calculator or think about the numbers in my head that multiply to be 45. And that's going to be 9 times 5, which turns into 3 radical 5. So when I write my final answer, it's negative 5 plus or minus 3 radical 5 all over 10. That is the exact answer, and that's as simplified as it can get. Now, to round it to the nearest tenth, I'm just going to go to the calculator and plug that in one at a time, but I need to make sure that we're typing it in correctly. So the whole numerator can go into one set of parentheses. That's negative 5, and then I'll do the plus 3 radical 5. I'll do the plus first, 3 radical 5. I need to make sure I get out of the radical and out of the parentheses before I do divided by 10. And when you hit enter, you should see negative 5 plus 3 radical 5 all in the numerator. If you don't, then you're looking at then you typed it in wrong. That ends up with 0.17082039325. The question says round to the nearest tenth. That's one decimal place. So we look at the second decimal place to determine whether it stays 0.1 or bumps up to 0.2, and it bumps up to 0.2. So 0.2 is one of our zeros. And then when we go to the calculator, what I can do is push the up button until my previous calculation is highlighted, hit enter, and that brings the whole calculation down. Then I can just slide over to the left here and change my plus sign to a subtraction sign, and that way I don't have to retype the whole thing. and rounded to the nearest tenth. This gives me negative 1.2 for my other 0. So there's our two answers. Positive 0.2 from the plus radical 3, from the plus 3 radical 5, and a minus 1.2 from the negative 3 radical 5. All right, so let's try another one. 2x squared minus 3. Notice something about this. The a value is 2, the b value is 0, but c is negative 3 because the subtraction sign is telling us it's negative. So let's plug these numbers into our formula. X equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. So our a value is 2. B value is 0. The c value is negative 3. So in the calculator, 0 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 3. We could probably do that in our heads. Negative 4 times negative 3 is a positive 12, and then 12 times 2 is 24. So this turns into x equals, the 0 we don't have to write. We can just put plus or minus radical 24 over 4. Now we have to simplify the square root of 24. So let's see. What's the largest perfect square factor of the number 24? Well, 24, 4, and 6. So it's 2 radical 6. That's our simplified version. So our final simplified answer, x equals plus or minus, oops, I should do it up here. X equals plus or minus 2 radical 6 over 4. But 2 divided by 4 is the same thing as 1/2. So plus or minus 1 radical 6 over 2, which I don't really need the 1. So I'm going to write it as plus or minus radical 6 over 2. So now on the calculator, I just need to do radical 6, positive radical 6 divided by 2 and negative radical 6 divided by 2. So if I do square root of 6, and then I can take that decimal and divide it by 2, so I can do it in 2 steps. I get 1.2247 rounded to the nearest 10th, or I'm sorry, 100th. This time it's the 100th. 100th is 2 decimal places, so you look at the third to see if the 2 should round up or stay at 2. In this case, it will stay at 2. So 1.22. Positive 1.22 for our positive root, and then negative 1.22 for the other one. Decimal is going to be the same for both. One's positive, one's negative. Hopefully you're doing okay. All right, try number 5. Pause the video. Try number 5 on your own. And when you come back, I'll tell you if you did it right or not. Same thing with number 6. Okay, so pause, try those 2 questions, then come back. Well, that was quick. Nice job. Hopefully you got the same thing as I did. If you did not, take a look at your work, take a look at my work, compare and share. And I hope you can figure out what went wrong. If not, we'll have to talk when we get back together. All right, so now let's do number 6. So pause the video and we'll do number 6. So to do number 6, we're going to find which one of these equations has a b squared minus 4ac, a discriminant that is a perfect square. All right, so if our discriminant, that calculation, b squared minus 4ac, you can ignore the rest of the equation. If you just test that part, if you figure out which one is a perfect square. So if I do this for number 1, I would get a discriminant of 96. So that is not a perfect square. That would be an irrational root. If I did it for the second one, I would get radical 28. That is not a perfect square. That would be irrational roots. For the third one, when I do that, I get a negative number. That's going to end up imaginary. And then for the last one, we get radical 16. That is a perfect square. That one will have rational roots. All right. So now off you go. Do some practice problems. The more you practice, the better you get at this. Um, and we are testing out soon. So go do practice, and then we'll chat soon. Stay safe, and good luck, and goodbye.